Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another in our series of CMI 75th Anniversary Leading Lights interviews. Now, this morning, I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by our 2015 Gold Medal winner, former Unilever CEO Paul Polman, who has written an amazing new book with sustainability business guru Andrew Winston called Net Positive, shortlisted for the FT Book of the Year award. What this book is saying is it's not enough for business to just do less bad. They absolutely have to do more good to tackle the two hugest problems that we face as a society, which are about inequality and sustainability. And this book represents their call to action using anecdotes, using their own experiences on what we need to see in the world of business to really finally deal with some of these issues. So welcome, Paul. Delighted to have you here this morning, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So firstly, before we get into Q&As, and by the way, you'll be able to ask Paul questions later on, tell us, why did you write this, and what spurred you to write it, and what are the key principles? What are your 5 key principles in the book?
Well, the first thing I need to say is, Anne, is thanks for having me, and obviously a lot of respect for you and CMI and your leadership. Congratulations on the 75th anniversary. Time goes fast, but you're an institution made to last, and that is because you're providing the most important services, which is create the leaders of today and tomorrow, and boy, do we need them. And it's also great to see that the Institute itself gets recognized in many different ways, not least the best place to work on your recognition for that. So credit to all of you. I'm interested in the multiplier effect. You know, you train over 100,000 leaders. You have 160,000 members. You publish a lot of things, share your knowledge. That ripple effect or that multiplier is what we need right now, as we are facing some of the biggest challenges, frankly, that humanity has changed. So thank you for that. We are familiar with the challenges, I think. Our global economic system isn't quite working. It is supposed to be. We're starting to see, frankly, that it's broken. COVID has brought that once more to life. It has made people realize that we can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. World Overshoot Day, which is the day that we use up more resources than the world can replenish, was this year, July 29th. In other words, actually, every day after that, we're frankly stealing from future generations. And we're paying a big price for that. Not least, for example, the destruction of biodiversity, having lost 68% of species, reptiles, mammals, in the last 5 decades alone, having 1 million species at risk. The zoonotic diseases that we're seeing, like Ebola, SARS, Zika, Asian flu, now a particularly nasty one with COVID, all direct results of us not living in harmony with Mother Nature. And the issue of climate change, I obviously don't need to tell you about. Now, normally we rely on well-elected, democratically functioning governments and a multilateral system where people cooperate. But unfortunately, that's not the case currently. Look, for example, at vaccine distribution and how unfair that is, with over 70% in the Western world having received their vaccines, but less than 6-7% in the developing markets. So our argument is very simple. When we face these challenges, when they urgently need to be addressed, when governments increasingly are unable to take the actions at the speed and scale that is needed, we feel that the private sector has an opportunity to step up. Business cannot succeed in failing societies, nor can it be a bystander in a system that gives it life in the first place. And increasingly, we're starting to see that happen. The recent examples, the COP26 in Glasgow, obviously dealing with the burning issue of climate change, an enormous presence of the private sector, of the financial sector there, in many cases ahead of governments, with broader industry coalitions, with setting the targets. And things are starting to move. What for us is now important is that we reframe our mindsets when we're overshooting these planetary boundaries, thinking corporate social responsibility which has to deal with less bad, is simply not good enough anymore. I hate the comparison, but if I'm a murderer, I used to kill 10 people, now I'm killing 5 people. Am I a better murderer? And this is frankly what we are doing in our economic system. So how can we reframe ourselves, not to think about less bad, which still is bad, but how can we think increasingly in the ways nature thinks, which is restorative, reparative, regenerative, and that is what we call net positive. For us, the hallmarks of a net positive company, first and foremost, are taking responsibility of your total handprint in society, all consequences, intended or not. We still see too many companies outsourcing their value chains and also thinking by that they can outsource their responsibilities. That just simply doesn't work anymore. We have to go well beyond what people call scope 1 and 2. Also, these companies understand that they have to optimize the return for all of their stakeholders. If you want to operate and be successful long-term in society, then you have to also ensure that all the people that make your businesses successful, not least your own employees as a starting point, are equally seeing the benefits from this. It also means that the shareholder returns are a result of what you do. These companies are driven by a broader objective. We ask ourselves in the book the very simple question: how can you profit from solving the world's problems, not creating the world's problems? And that profit is a result of your presence here, trying to be regenerative. And then last but not least, these companies actually participate in the broader transformations that society needs. They go well beyond their own organization to ensure that we have the right systems, rules, laws, regulations, or frameworks in place, if you want to. And as a result, these companies understand the power of cooperation and working with people. Ultimately, it boils down to leadership. You cannot have transformations in your company if your leadership doesn't go through a transformation, and you cannot get the broader systems transformations if these company transformations don't happen. So it is courageous companies thrive by giving more than they take, but ultimately it's actually the courageous leadership that makes that possible. And I always like to end a little bit with Rumi, who is the 13th century Iranian poet, who I think said it well when he said, "Yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today I am wise, so I'm changing myself." And that's the essence of what we're really trying to get across in this book.
Well, that's a great quote. Now, one of the I guess one of the catalysts for your wanting to write this book was your own experience at Unilever when you had the Kraft Heinz approach, and you were forced to look at how you were doing business versus, that of what that takeover approach meant to you, and you call it the ketchup versus mayonnaise. So. What did you learn firsthand when you were up against that kind of short-termism, or being less bad murderers in business versus trying to do good? And what were some of the challenges that you had to deal with?
Well, here are, first of all, I'm happy that this happened in my 8th year of my 10-year tenure, and was obviously better prepared for it. And frankly, we had a very good track record. Over the 10 years, Unilever has had a 300% return for our shareholders. Every year we outgrew top and bottom line most of our competitive set. So this wasn't an issue of underperformance. But then someone comes in with a 17% higher offer, basically financially manipulating your balance sheets, if you want to finance a takeover like this, frankly, with our own money. And what you see here is fairly opposing business models. One that is focused on serving the billions of people, which we tried to do. We actually had made a real commitment in our Unilever Sustainable Living Plan to reach over 1 billion people and improve their health and hygiene, things like hand washing and toothbrushing and nutritious food and all the other things. And the other model that was basically geared towards a few billionaires that would look after their own interest. One that was based on values, producing value, whilst the other entirely was focused on value. And so I could not think of two more opposing models that frankly didn't make any synergistic sense. We were very proud to be on the top of many of these indexes, be it sustainable sourcing or human rights or or gender balance that is very close to your heart, whilst we would find them usually on the bottom of most of these indexes and discharge all that externality to society. Now, unfortunately, there are always people in the financial market that are wrongly incentivized and get rewarded on their quarterly performance, outperforming the market if you want to. So when there is an opportunity of a 17% immediate lift in a share price, which, by the way, clearly was manipulated before by these same elements in the financial market, in my opinion. We saw short selling more than double the weeks before the takeover bid. That is still unexplainable to me. But anyway, having said that, there are people tempted to jump on this short-term opportunity and not really invest in the longer term. So we need to really work on reward systems and incentive systems to get the right behavior there, even for the bigger asset managers that we have. But I believe that because of a 10-year cultivating our shareholders, having given them decent returns, explaining to them our model of value creation, even if this would have come to a vote, which it never did. They disappeared after a weekend. But even if this would have come to a vote, I tend to believe that most of our shareholders would have stayed with us. We have seen really over that period of transformation of Unilever, quite a drastic change in our shareholder base. By abolishing our quarterly profits and moving to a longer term compensation plans, getting rid of guidance, we actually got less of the short-term speculators and more of the longer-term investors that understood our strategy. Our rotation of shares in the top 100 went down significantly. Our shareholdings of the top 10 were significantly higher. So we had a more loyal, longer-term shareholder base. And that's probably one of the lessons. Many of the CEOs actively cater to their current shareholders, which is very difficult to do in some cases, as many have different objectives. It is much better to actively seek the right longer-term shareholders, but that obviously takes time. When we started our model, we didn't really have a good explanation of why this longer-term multi-stakeholder model was actually also a better shareholder creating model. We simply didn't have the data. So it was not surprising that we needed to do a lot of education, that many in the financial market were skeptical. But I think fast forward to where we are today, and you have quite a lot of evidence that everything being equal, a more gender balanced organization or a more gender balanced board has a higher chance of better performance. A company that aggressively tries to reduce its carbon impact has a better performance. A company that takes responsibility of human rights in its value chain has a more resilient organization and a better performance. So in general, these things increasingly are being able to link to financial performance. So much easier in that sense for companies nowadays to start to defend that model. And it's not surprising that you see the financial market starting to move, that you see more and more companies starting to move in that direction and embrace ESG, put sustainability in the heart of their strategy. What we now need to do is not anymore explain the whys, but very frankly, focus on the hows, because that's where most people struggle.
Yes, that's a very good point. But, yet, despite the overwhelming success, excuse me, of Unilever and all of the data points and evidence, which obviously you detail in the book and are becoming more widely known, and despite the fact that 75% of people say they want CEOs to lead on these things, and you've proven that it's actually better for shareholders and better for business outcomes, but we still get these behaviors. I was talking this morning on the Today program about a CEO in the financial services that fired 900 people by a Zoom, right? No empathy, no compassion, just you're out. Just right after he had raised $750 million. You call it the short-term margin sugar rush, I think. So what do we need to do to change these behaviors? What systematic changes would you like to see?
Well, and that is this is a topic in itself that we could talk for hours. But what is important is that this is not a crisis of climate change or inequality or food security. This is a crisis of greed, of apathy, of selfishness, and you're referring to that. So that is why in the book, the starting point for us is, do you care? And I think we do need to create the right leaders. It's very clear that what we've seen in during COVID, that the leaders that were operating with a higher level of empathy, compassion, as you rightfully say, humanity, humility, were purpose-driven, understand the power of partnership, think multi-generational, that these type of leaders evoke a higher level of trust that ultimately is that main ingredient for prosperity. So there is a clear bifurcation happening between the leaders that you want to work for, that you want to give it all, versus the leaders that, quote unquote, leaders that don't exhibit these traits. So you need to start actually with leadership education. That's the starting point. The way we've taught people in the most popular educational program called the MBA, the Masters of Business Administration, is basically creating little Milton Friedmans on steroids. So if we don't teach the more collaborative leadership versus the competitive leadership, if we don't teach these broader values and make them systems leaders, it's not going to work. So that's one of the areas I'm actually focused on. The second, so it starts with the individual. The second thing is really that many of these challenges that we face, the leaders actually want to attack them. If you really look at it, there are very few CEOs who want more unemployment, more air pollution, more people going to bed hungry. They simply don't exist. Yet collectively, we behave in a different way than the desired outcomes that we would like. So the reason for that is the boundaries in which we operate. Very simply put, if you incentivize a salesperson on the number of orders he has to write or she has to write, you'll get a different behavior than if you incentivize them on customer relationships, for example. That's the same in society. So collectively, we have to step in and move these boundaries. One of the main reasons why I stopped quarterly reporting in Unilever was not very heroic in itself, but it was to give people space to run these businesses for the longer term. And that needs to happen in society as well. And what we find is that individual leaders are held to a very high standard, but some of that they frankly can't deliver on. None of the companies can transform the market to regenerative agriculture or stop deforestation or get rid of the issues of plastics in the oceans just by themselves. So increasingly, you need to form these broader alliances. First of all, in your own value chain and in your industry, we call that 1 + 1 = 11, and how to do that and create these partnerships, which are incredibly difficult. But then also the broader partnerships with civil society and the governments, and we call that it takes 3 to tango, how to drive these broader systems changes. And like leadership, ultimately, you arrive at the right level of leadership if you understand that by putting the interest of others ahead of yourself, you're also better off. That is the same at the company level. When you come to the realization that it is better to work together on some of these major issues, especially when it concerns the future of humanity, than compete. So indeed, shifting this pre-competitive space and cooperating to jointly solve and find solutions is probably one of the bigger challenges for CEOs.
Yeah, and actually you highlight that as a critical principle, the allyship you had from corners as diverse as Greenpeace and the unions when you, for example, faced that collision of business models in that takeover that surprised you, the support you got from all the quarters because you had cultivated these collaborative relationships, which of course is very important. But you know, most of our listeners this morning and most of our 160,000 members aren't CEOs. They're aspiring managers, they're middle managers, they're senior managers, and they, as we've discussed, believe in the kinds of behaviors, largely, not all of them, but most of them, that you want to see. So what can they do? What would you advocate that they do to bring about more change in this direction of net positive?
Whilst we say in the book that it is absolutely key to have the leadership and the senior management fully bought into this and drive this, you know, the fish starts rotting at the head, they say in the Netherlands. So that's a very important thing. But the reality is in any organization, the main functioning of that organization, the ideas, the creativity, the work, the implementation on the ground where it ultimately counts is done by all of us. So the principles actually of the book apply to all of us. It starts with ourselves having that realization that we can make a difference, that we can work on something bigger than ourselves, that we can make an influence. And it requires that same awareness in all of us on what are the things that we care about. We now see very clearly that increasingly the main challenge for CEOs is actually talent, and attraction of talent. And talent is self-selecting now companies based on really their purpose, their contribution to society. And you've clearly seen that with your example of the CEO in the financial world. I would be surprised not to see a significant hit in the engagement scores or the attractiveness of an employer of a company like this. What we saw in Unilever, with the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, is we got 2 million people applying to us every year, 75% because of that broader purpose. Our engagement scores went from the bottom of the middle where we were when the business wasn't run so well to the top of the top tercile. And that alone already should be enough to explain business results. So what you now see, surprisingly to many, is that in every company now you have a Greta Thunberg, in my opinion. For the first time, you see nearly on a weekly basis now companies where employees go on strike because they don't agree with some of the things management is saying or management is doing, and they're calling them out. So the influence of employees across the company is probably much bigger than we realize. So it's all of these elements. What you can do if you're in the company is, and you are aware, you're clear on where you can make a difference, is to educate management. I think there is now many examples where we can actually improve our business operations, be more sustainable, be more equitable, make our businesses more resilient, and immediately get financial benefits from that. But management is simply not aware. There's just too many things coming at them or going on, and it is a task from all of us to educate. So whatever function you're in, I think it's easy to show right now that in 60-70% of the cases globally, you can buy green energy and be cheaper than the old fossil fuel, or you can move to a sustainable sourcing and have a higher yield or resilience in your value chain. You can start working differently with all of your suppliers and work in partnerships. These are all things that happen at middle or lower management. So just get going and walk the walk instead of talk the talk. And bit by bit, you can, I think, influence management in a positive way. If ultimately management doesn't get it, which I know is the case in a few companies, but frankly, not the majority anymore, but then just, find another job. And these companies will self-select themselves out of business. There are companies that want to preserve their own self-interest, or where management is in denial, or where senior management has a shorter term focus and frankly, their own self-interest. But increasingly, we have shown, especially since COVID again once more, that most of these companies are headed towards the graveyard of dinosaurs, whilst the companies that understand it, that adjust, that position themselves well for the future, create this more sustainable, equitable business model, are increasingly doing better. And that's ultimately the test of what we're talking about.
Absolutely. And, we talk about the great resignation, or people actually voting with their feet. Well, you've given some examples what middle managers can do to encourage greater good, doing more good. So do those partnerships to make your supply chains more sustainable and your communities more equitable. But what about the flip side, the bad behavior? I remember interviewing you for my gender balance book. You gave a great analogy where you said, I'd never believed in incentivizing managers for having greater gender equality. I treated it like I would health and safety in a factory. If they don't get with the program, if they don't promote more diverse and more women, it's like, being a factory manager who has health and safety accidents on their watch, and I have to get rid of them. Do you encourage employees to call out the bad or toxic behavior that they see in their management? And what advice would you give them?
Well, absolutely. And I think one of the reasons we and many other companies went to the 360s in terms of performance reviews, for example, is because of that. That gives a broader transparency. Also, continuous employee surveys. In Unilever, we did dipsticks, we called them, nearly on a monthly basis about samples. Obviously, it was a big company, so we could take 3,000 to 5,000 employees. And we had the tougher questions in there about the perception on management, the clarity of the strategies and objectives and behaviors. And often the big gap, as you well know, as you drive a company culture, is a combination of values and behaviors. But the missing element is often the behavior. The reason why the Enrons or the Wells Fargos or the Boeings or the GEs go off the cliff, and that list is very long nowadays, is not because they have great values on paper or even get the prices for these values, but it's simply because the behavior doesn't match. And you still see that today. 75% of the CEOs actually say we have a great purpose and we have a great purpose statement and reason for being, whilst 25% of the employees really say we see our management behaving like that. The moment there is a little bit of pressure, this is where the test is. Some people say what you do in the dark is what makes you shine in the light, but too many leaders still gravitate towards the short term and the shareholder when pressure is there, and not really live this multiple stakeholder model. And we've seen many examples of that on the bad side during COVID as well. But I think increasingly it's clear that companies that keep their heads cool, that look at this more longer term and invest in all these stakeholders, are doing better. And frankly, the financial market is catching on. It's rapidly moving from risk mitigation to opportunity. In Glasgow, we saw $130 trillion of money under management, which is half the world's money, making commitments to be net zero. We see most of the shareholder propositions that are coming in now dealing with ESG. There are questions being asked now to boards or CEOs that have never been asked before, like from money into politics to human rights to demanding climate change plans and making them public. So I think that train has left the station, and management would be very wise to jump on that. And frankly, again, once more, there's overwhelming evidence that if they do, their businesses would be better off. I like to always refer to the work that George Saracen is doing at Harvard behind weighted impact accounts, where he has now shown on a sample of over 3,000 companies that the companies, even within the same sector, the ones that more actively mitigate their negative externalities are already being higher valued by the financial markets than the ones that don't, which means that these issues that people historically have called non-material are increasingly already, for the smart part of the financial market, become material. That's why ESG investing is projected to be $50 trillion by 2025, and I think we'll get there earlier. I mean, the things are moving at a speed probably faster than people realize, and the financial market has actually become a driver of that. They don't get too much credit. I don't think they're really moved by the morality of the case as much as they should. But at the end of the day, the economics are starting to speak.
Okay. Well, obviously, you mentioned at Glasgow, half the world's capital was making commitments, but looming very large in the control of that capital and the accumulation of that capital are the tech giants. And as we were talking before we began, half of the advertising is now in the hands of just 3 of these tech giants. Half of the world's advertising outside of China, which is an amazing statistic. I think you'll agree. What do they need to be doing more? Because one of your principles is, if you break it, you buy it. You've got to own it. And I think we agree that they do good, but there's also a dark side. So what do they need to do to take more responsibility for solving these issues? What would you like to see?
So the most important thing is really the overall message of the book is to get your business models into a net positive, into a restorative, reparative, regenerative. When you have platforms where the children become addicted, you can't call that restorative. When you have a platform that undermines democracy, you can't call that regenerative. When you have hate speech on the platforms, you can call that re-energizing if you want to. So instead of just celebrating the wonderful thing that you can create little businesses, or that can provide education to the remote places in the world, and whatever you have, you do have to take the responsibility of your total impact. Just as a company like Unilever has to solve the issues of food waste or stunting or deforestation or obesity, so do these tech companies have to attack these broader societal issues that these platforms have brought with them. And they have all the capabilities to do that. And when they deny that, like is often the case with the company most often called out, like Facebook, just call a spade, then I think, short term, you might still see some value creation, but longer term, that trust with society is eroding, and that cannot be the right strategy to be successful over the longer term. And so here, the multi-stakeholder model, the responsibility of owning what you break plays out as importantly as in any other sector. And these industries would be wise to be proactive there, or otherwise they will be regulated out of business. And there's a lot of talk about that. There's a lot of penalties floating around, a lot of investigations happening, a lot of people turning off from these platforms ultimately. So that cannot be healthy. And they are young cultures. They probably are not yet as mature. They have young leaders that have been brilliant in creating these companies, but probably less skilled in running these larger organizations with the responsibilities that come with it. And that now needs to happen. And you're starting to see signs of that. Companies like Microsoft committing to take carbon out of the air since their inception in 1975. Companies like Google trying to use the algorithms to help people make more sustainable choices and positively influence consumer habits. Taking broader responsibilities in their value chains, like some of them are starting to do. These are the initial signs of net positive, but now it needs to be done consistently throughout all of their business models, not just cherry picking and celebrating. And this is where probably most companies still have some work to do.
Yes, absolutely. Well, you mentioned earlier the principle of it takes three to tango, right? Business, society, and government. I know that you're not, one of the premises of the book is governments aren't exactly racing ahead on this stuff. But, what do you think is the role of government? What would you like to see them do? And do you have any examples of a government that does it well?
So there is obviously a challenge right now, and I think it's very difficult to be a politician right now. And the reason we see these populists, nationalists, or xenophobics in some circumstances, which looks like more than we've ever had before, is probably not the fault of these individuals, but it's because we haven't addressed these basic issues. And people are increasingly getting desperate, and they go in the streets or they make their protest votes clear in the polls. And, Brexit is a sad but clear example of that as well, if I'm not insulting too many people that are listening. So we need to help the politicians. They have become increasingly more short-term, jumping from one election cycle to the other. So what our argument in the book is certainly not to exclude the politicians, far from it. We cannot get to these broader systems changes and address these issues like inequality and climate change if we don't have the right frameworks in place, if we don't empower these politicians to make the tougher choices and actually support them in these choices. Like climate change, for example, or on food systems that need to be transformed. We have per subsidies of $500-600 billion that actually push you in the wrong direction. We've seen quick rescue packages coming out with COVID that were actually supporting, in some cases, the fossil industry more than positioning ourselves in this greener, more resilient future that we all know we need to go to. So the best way to do this for companies who are immediately affected, who pay the consequences well before governments into their balance sheets, is to work together on at industry level, or as I said, your value chains, and work together with civil society to help de-risk. And this is very much what we saw in Glasgow, if you take climate change as an example, where 200 companies in the shipping industry, where multiple organizations in the airlines, where 20% of the steel industry, and I'm deliberately taking these high abatement sectors, the high emission sectors, went together and create these coalitions and say, yeah, it can be done, it is possible. But we need you to put the right incentives in place or the right frameworks, or at least not slow us down. And if governments see, in this case, that this is the growth story of the century, that you can actually create more and more resilient jobs, and you give them that confidence that business is able to do that, often backed up by technology, then they're willing to take more risks themselves. The European Green Deal, the farm to fork package, the biodiversity package, the circular economy package are all examples where responsible business has worked together with governments to give them the courage to implement this without the fear of losing our overall economic competitiveness. And increasingly, we're actually starting to see that it drives competitiveness and it drives our economies into a direction that I think people are increasingly looking for, which is overall health and well-being, and not just simple, narrow GDP definitions of producing more stuff.
Yeah, no, it's incredibly important. Well-being is actually the number one managerial challenge in our surveys. That's what most people want their managers and leaders to worry about, including those in the public sector. So I want to open it up for questions, but before we get to those questions, what's the one thing you would like our managers and leaders listening on this call today, or indeed we're going to be using this as part of our 75th anniversary, what's the one message you'd like them to take away from Net Positive?
Well, the real message actually is it's an enormous opportunity for the ones that get it. We spent $17 trillion on COVID just now to save lives and livelihoods, and we're not near out of it. The global economy has lost 27 trillion, according to the IMF, for over this decade in economic value. We have seen clearly with COVID that you can't have healthy people on an unhealthy planet. We've also seen that the cost of not acting is becoming significantly higher than the cost of acting, which means that for the ones that understand it, this is an enormous economic opportunity, and businesses would be wise to seize that. And increasingly the ones that do, and it's not only the Teslas or the Orsteds that are leaders in their industry, but increasingly we see companies converting also in the toughest industries that I just talked about. They will reap the benefits from that. So, but it starts with yourself. It starts with your own courageous leadership, setting the targets that not are just targets that you can get away with, but targets that are needed, and that takes courage. Because often you don't know how to get there or don't have the answers. Work in the broader partnerships, that takes courage. Driving these deeper transformations and involving government and civil society takes courage. So ultimately, the message is it's courageous leadership. And I deliberately use the word courage because it comes from the French word cœur. It starts with the heart. And increasingly, we need to bring humanity back to business and have leaders that can operate both with the head and the heart. And these leaders will be enormously successful to seize these opportunities that I talked about.
Absolutely. We couldn't agree more at CMI. I'm going to open it up for questions. Our first question comes from Dean. Good morning. I'm working on our purpose, and I'm trying to be authentic, driving change in our business, not just words. I'm meeting lots of internal cynicism. How do you deal with that?
Sorry, I caught that there was a little disruption in the thing. Can you repeat for 1 second? Sorry.
Sure. He's saying, I'm working on our purpose and I'm trying to be authentic, driving change in our business, not just words. I'm meeting lots of internal cynicism. How did you deal with that?
Yeah, frankly, I have to say I like skepticism, but I don't like cynicism, if I may be very frank. The skeptics are very good because they challenge you and they make you better, and they often lead to a path that is a better outcome than you would have come to by yourself. But cynics are people that don't want to take responsibility, that are actually draining energy versus giving energy. They are little cancers in an organization that if you don't curtail them, that spreads. So you spend time first and foremost on talking to these people, hopefully providing training and tools and putting incentives in place to take the excuses away. But if then some people don't believe in it, which basically boils down to the values that you want to exert as an organization, then they will have to look somewhere else for opportunities that better match their skill sets. But I don't have time for those. And even in Unilever, we had to change 70 of the top 100 people to get the right people in the right place. But there were some that just didn't believe in it, that just said, this is nonsense, and why should I do this? I had to do that with a board member. I had to do that with an internal board member. And you do that in a very frank and honest and friendly way, because often then they find something else that better matches their values and are happier than being in a system where it doesn't match. So you have to be providing the opportunities, also the opportunities for change on the cynics. And if that doesn't happen, you have to deal with it. The skeptics, actually, you have to embrace them because they make you better.
Great answer. The next question is from Aaron. Do you have any translatable insights for SMEs and even mid-cap public companies to shift from doing less bad to a net positive future of sustained growth? Great question, because most businesses are indeed SMEs.
In the world itself, 95% of the economy is SMEs, and if you don't change the SMEs, you cannot change the global system. So this is absolutely key. And this is I used to chair the International Chambers of Commerce. These are 48 million companies. Most of them are SMEs. The UN Global Compact, which I now chair for the Secretary General, has 17,000 organizations. Most of them are SMEs. The good thing is that if you're an SME, often you are closer to the world, to the outside in, as I call it, to the consumers that you serve, and you are more agile to adapt. For Unilever to move to sustainable palm oil or sustainable tea, we really have to transform the world markets and often government systems, etc. But if you are a smaller company, you can do that quite quickly. And that's why you see that many of the areas where you see growth and success are actually not the incumbents, but are actually the newcomers in the industry. So I do believe you have an advantage if you can maintain that agility and if you can be close to the world. Now, then it comes to knowledge and how do we know what to do? There's a lot of it out there. Some of it obviously has to come from your own reading and your own interest, but other things is really associating yourself with the more efficient organizations. The Global Compact has programs like making global goals local business, or how to mitigate the effects of climate change in your value chain. The International Chamber of Commerce has the same thing, and I'm sure there are plenty of other organizations out there. So associate yourself with it, often at low cost. For example, in fashion, we have brought 80 companies together in what we call the Fashion Pact, many of them smaller companies, 250 brands. And together, they're now starting to buy green energy that individually they wouldn't have the skill to do that. Together, they're starting to convert to regenerative cotton. Together, they're setting new standards on delivery of their clothes in their value chain to get rid of single-use plastics. So get behind some of these alliances to drive these bigger changes. And finally, if you're an SME, many of the SMEs are tied into some of the bigger companies, and become familiar with their plans and what they do, and try to leverage their resources. In Unilever, our Partner to Win program, our supplier codes were very much geared to get everybody on one page. And what we found was it was tremendously beneficial for the SMEs who understood that, who adapted, and actually became very loyal partners and grew with the success of Unilever themselves as well.
So some great advice there for SMEs. Next question is from Clive. Question for Paul. I have discovered that many organizations are positively impacting the SDGs, those are Sustainable Development Goals set by the UN, often without knowing it. What are your thoughts?
Well, you don't need to know everything. The Sustainable Development Goals, which I had the honor to develop as part of the high-level panel appointed by then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, is 17 goals and 169 targets. And that's a little bit overwhelming. But basically, it's the scorecard of the world. What are the issues where we fall short? What are the opportunities to address? And just looking at 4 areas, health and well-being, mobility, energy transition, and food and land use, we found an opportunity to unlock, just in those 4 areas alone, $12 trillion this decade, and create 380 million more jobs. So I think instinctively, many companies are trying to look at these opportunities and try to find answers. That's, after all, what the entrepreneurs do. But the most important thing is not to justify. That's a little bit like the shared value concept. Or we employ people, or we produce something, so people that use it must be happy, otherwise they wouldn't pay. So we justify like we're already doing the Sustainable Development Goals. Here, the trick, I think, is what we're talking about is how you're actively addressing the gaps. It doesn't serve anything to say we're providing shampoos, but all the bottles end up in the ocean, and the way you produce it is violating human rights and enormous carbon emission. What you now need to look at is holistically, how can you profit from solving the world's problems, not creating them? How can you answer the very simple question that is the world better off because your business is in it, yes or no? And that requires this more holistic view that we're explaining in our book, Net Positive. And that is probably the most difficult thing for people to grasp. So it's not a rationalization or a post-justification. It is a proactive changing of your business models to truly become regenerative.
Yeah, and I think picking up on that, that was one of the things that you often said about your sustainable living program. You didn't really know how you were going to get there. You just knew you needed to get there, right? So dealing with that ambiguity and accepting that you don't have all the answers is probably a pretty critical ingredient for affecting the kind of change we're talking about. Would you agree?
Absolutely. 100%. As we talked before, setting targets that you know are needed, not targets that you can get away with. Taking responsibility of your total impact and saying that you're going to address that, even though many of the things are not under your direct control. That takes courage. And even if you don't have all the answers or might not achieve all these targets, the fact that you say we want to do this is a very powerful thing. In Unilever, we simply said we don't have all the answers and we can't do it alone. And it made us more human. It made us open, transparent. It resulted in these enormous partnerships that you were alluding to before that helped us achieve things that we simply wouldn't achieve otherwise. We had well over 1 billion people that we reached with improving their health and well-being, but it came from partnerships with Save the Children, with UNICEF, with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or with USAID or DFID in the UK here, and that comes from trust and transparency.
Yeah, very important. Now, next question, also important from Usman. How do or should I, as a business proprietor or CEO, value my employees, and what role will that play in the growth of the business?
Oh, well, first of all, value them more than yourself. A leader in an organization should realize that they probably don't know much. The finance manager will know more about finance than you do. The person who runs the UK or whatever brand you have will know more about that than you do. The person who is in HR will know more about human resources than you do. So your task is to make them successful. You actually work for them. And it's the leaders that understand that they invest in others and make them more successful will be the leaders themselves that will be successful ultimately. So it is all about your employees. It is all about empowering them and certainly not having the notion of them working for you, as you hear too often. But I would say switch that mindset of you working for them. And the more you empower them, the more you create an environment where each and everybody can rise to that fullest potential, the more you lift the basic human values of dignity, respect, and equity for everybody, and provide these opportunities, the better your business will be, and the more engaged your workforce will be. And that is what we all call this high performance environment that we aspire to. And it requires probably the most important ingredient, which is trust. It is very clear that principle-based organizations do much better than rule-based organizations. And I've often said the best way to get there is to delegate authority down to the level of where the knowledge is. And in most organizations, that's not at the board level.
Very true, and very much what we advocate at CMI. It's about trusting your employees and building that engagement, and actually that engagement produces far better results when you have an engaged employee base that feels empowered. So it's a great answer. Okay,
it's close to your heart, and I know, sorry to interrupt, but I know it's close to your heart, but it's also important that everybody understands that they have the same opportunities. So that is what I call equity. You know, it's very dear to your heart and your wonderful book on gender equality, but the same is with disability, the same is with age, the same is with socioeconomic background differences. You need to be sure that you create an environment where each and everybody can rise to their fullest potential. And that's probably a bigger need right now, as we've also seen during COVID, where again, the people that we need most were least appreciated. And if we don't change that and make it more inclusive, we will never get there.
Well, let me pick up on that before I go to a great question from Rachel. So what we're for our 75th anniversary, we're looking exactly at all of these areas. We're looking at age, disability, at gender, at race, at socioeconomic background. Now, obviously, some people say, I don't know where to begin, or I need to do them all at the same time, or I can't make progress in one area at the expense of another area. Obviously, you're one of the pioneers of engineering equality into Unilever. What's your advice? Do I tackle everything at once? Do I do things one at a time? And what's the role of data in doing that?
Yeah, I don't see it as tackling everything at once because they're the same thing. They're basically defending the basic values that humanity is based on, of dignity and respect for everybody, of equity, of compassion. Often we have now with Caroline Casey the wonderful initiative which I chair, which is called the Valuable 500, where we have 500 of the most iconic companies making a commitment to discuss disability at board level. There are 1.3 billion people with disabilities. That's 15% of the world population. It can happen to all of us today or tomorrow, God forbid. But the workforce is only 2-3% at best of people with disability in there. So there's a basic seismic change that needs to happen here. And we call CEOs and we say, do you want to be part of this? All we ask you is to commit it at board level and put plans in place, share best practices and all the other things that you know. So it's not very onerous. And many CEOs say, no, I cannot, because this year, because of George Floyd, I need to work on racial. Or we are still so busy with gender, I can't do anything else. Then my HR department get pulled in different directions. I mean, these are not leaders that are going to make it, because what we're really talking about here is one project called inclusion that has many different dimensions. And for some reason, business leaders can deal with complexities of having 100 customers or 1,000 different SKUs and all these complexities. But when it gets to the core of the business, all of a sudden they have to make choices because this group this year and that group next year just doesn't work. So if you don't see that as an integrated plan, you'll never get there. And that's obviously what we try to discuss with them and make them aware of.
Sure. And data plays a key role in that, right? Because you have to be able to know where you are and where you want to get to. What do you say to businesses that perhaps don't have that data? How do you get it?
Well, some of that is let me see how I answer that. I work a lot with the blind and deaf blind, and our foundation is in that area. We have 26,000 kids in school in East Africa. And I worked with Perkins School of the Blind in Boston, Massachusetts, where Helen Keller went. So I studied a lot about the life of Helen Keller, who spoke 6 languages, was blind and deaf. And people were always amazed. But they also said to her, it must be horrible to be blind and deaf. And she said, no, the worst thing is not being blind and deaf. The worst thing is having eyes and not being able to see. And I think there are many of the CEOs, if you want to, that have eyes, but they're not able to see. I remember one of the CEOs saying, oh yeah, we had a management meeting and we were all on the beach in Florida. And all of a sudden I discovered that there weren't any women. Or, I realized that women also need to have the same opportunities as men when I got a daughter. It changed my life. I mean, come on, where have you been? So you need some data, but you don't need so many data to see how many people of color are in your company, how many people with disability are there, how many women do you have in management. So yeah, it's nice to have the data to start to drive behavior changes, to compare and to get to best practices. We all understand that, but 90% of what we're talking here about is in the heart. And really believing in it and living it in your daily lives as well. It's not only a company issue. And these are the basic human values I think we talk about in the book, and why we call this leadership transformation such an important element.
Absolutely. And it goes back to that courage, that cri de coeur of having the moral courage and the heart to do the right thing. So the last question I'm going to ask you is a great question. It's from Rachel. And she's asking, Paul, what is your main burning ambition to achieve in the next 2 to 3 years? What does it look like for you?
So, Rachel, that's a very important thing. What I just fully focus on is to try to accelerate the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, and climate change and inequality is very important. We simply can't wait till 2050 to stay below 1.5 degrees. We have now 7 years left for this decade. We need to have a 45% reduction in carbon emissions if we want to have only a small chance of staying at 1.5 degrees, which, by the way, is by all means possible. So that's one of my key focus areas, and using my current strengths, if you want to, or expertise or reputation, whatever you want to call it, is to really bring the private sector together and move that at scale, and that will keep us busy. We do that with Imagine, we do that with the book, we do that with the other efforts that I'm associated with. The second thing is really creating the right leadership. Ultimately, this is a shared responsibility where we have to get people to rise to a higher level of consciousness, where they have to understand that by seeking enlightenment just to enhance your own is not really getting there, but putting yourself to the service of others will ultimately be the key driver of the changes that we need. So these are my focus areas. That's why I took the chairmanship of the Side Business School, or on the board of Prime Principles for Responsible Management Education, to really create this wave of change that we desperately need in management education. So people side, skill side, leadership side, as well as system change side.
Well, what I can say to help you in that is, at CMI, we work with over 800 partners in management education, from everything from business schools to private training providers, employers, and FE colleges. And we have our framework for best practices in management and leadership. We review it every couple of years. And obviously, that's where our learner community of over 100,000 comes. And so what I would like to commit to you, Paul, is as we revise that framework, we're going to take those principles that are in Net Positive and try to build them into our frameworks for what good should look like in management and leadership education, which is absolutely at the core of CMI's mission, because we agree with your message, we applaud your efforts, and we'll do everything we can to support you in your incredible undertakings with Net Positive, Imagine, and all that you do, to make sure that we all in the world do more good and not just less bad.
Love to take you up on that. Thanks. We need it. We need all of us.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been absolutely incredible. If you've enjoyed listening to today, please consider joining CMI. You can find out how to do so in the chat. And again, Paul, thank you so much for participating in our 75th anniversary. We will be repurposing many aspects of this conversation as we move into our 75th year. And we've got another 75 ahead to try and bring to life some of these principles. So thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thanks for the opportunity. Enjoy the holiday season, and above all, be safe. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, stay positive and test negative.